when I was 13, I got into a fight with Gary Hodges. Yes, the Gary Hodges, the notorious Gary Hodges. Now, I can't remember how the fight began. We're at school, talking to each other in the corridor. I can remember feeling a sense of anxiety or threat by his presence. And before I knew it, we started shoving each other, or I should say nudging each other. And with each nudge, I'd go, yeah, and Gary Hodges would nudge me and respond with, yeah. And so the frequency of the nudges increased, and so did the volume of the yeah, yeah. And so it went on. It seemed like forever, but probably only about a minute or two, until the senior sports teacher came along and broke up the fight. I want to reflect today on the nature of violence, and particularly the role of men in violence, or how men handle conflict. Now, I'm not saying that women don't experience conflict, but I do think that some men handle conflict in a particular way. I'm also not implying that all men are violent. I think most men are not violent. But there's a significant minority of men who are very violent and feel entitled to be violent. And that little cameo that I had with Gary Hodges was, I thought, a very useful personal insight, that I didn't like this guy. I felt uncomfortable with Gary Hodges. And my first instinct was, when I felt threatened by him, my first response to fear was to put on some bravado, to give him a shove back and go, yeah, as though by raising my voice and acting out this false machismo, it would solve the issue. In recent months, we've seen a bit of schoolyard bullying taking place in our politics. I'm thinking particularly of the tension between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. And I can identify elements of the schoolyard brawl in the way they are operating. On the one hand, no one wants to exonerate the policies and practices of the government of China. You only have to look at instances like the treatment of the Uyghurs or their incursions into the South China Seas. On the other hand, we don't want to exonerate Trump either. Just take, for example, a look at the very poor, in fact, the difficult response he's made to the serious issues around Black Lives Matter. What I'm interested in at this point is the way they deal with each other. Just like in those schoolyard days, each of them is anxious or threatened by the other, and is responding in a bellicose manner of yeah. They're finding their own ways of giving the other a shove. Now, the reason I'm focusing on these two is because you could pick many other examples, but they're the two most powerful countries in the world. And so the tension between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump is not just their problem, it's our problem. It affects everyone. And I think it's important not only that we understand something about the nature of violence, but from a Christian perspective, that churches are in the forefront of challenging violent behaviour, violent language, and violent thinking. All these things need to be challenged. Now, in order to give it a kind of a framework, I want to pick up the Christian feast of the Transfiguration, which took place on Wednesday. Now, there's a wonderful, well, I think an important coincidence that in the Christian church, the 6th of August is the day where the Feast of Transfiguration is honoured. It's also the day where we acknowledge the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. So on the one hand, Hiroshima symbolises the violence of the world. We've certainly changed our understanding of the significance of Hiroshima in recent decades, and we realise that the motivation for the bombing was far more complex and nuanced than what we were led to believe. But nevertheless, it's become a symbol, a universal symbol of violence. And on the other hand, we have the story of the Transfiguration. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, it's a fantastic story. And in many ways, it's an exercise of the early church in using its theological imagination to understand the significance of the ministry of Jesus. The story is simple. Jesus and some followers go to the top of a mountain. That's always a cue for something important is going to take place. And while on the top of the mountain, Jesus is bathed in light. Poor old Peter doesn't get the significance of it. And the significance is that in this wonderful creation, the significance of the ministry and the importance of Jesus is affirmed before them. Like I said, it represents the church looking back, saying to itself, who was this Jesus? And how do we interpret his significance? And for the early church, Jesus brought in this news, this wonderful news of the possibility of personal transformation and even societal transformation. He was the bearer of good news about the possibility of deep and lasting transformation. So this day, the 6th of August, it reminds us of the violence of the world, but also it presents to us a remarkable symbol of transformation, the possibility of transformation. It's that possibility which keeps us going. Now let's return then to the 21st century. Let me assure you at this point, I'm not heading towards trying to solve world peace today. I tried that when I was a teenager, probably as part of my response to my altercation with Gary Hodges. I am going to reflect about what role we can play, and particularly what role people of faith can play in the context of violence. I began, of course, with the story of two schoolyard bullies of myself and Gary Hodges, but I think it fits well with what we see being played out amongst political leaders and how they treat each other, how often the initial response to differences of agreement, to anxiety and to fear is to up the ante. Not only is the response to up the ante, but also to claim a right to do so. In other words, the political bullies of our age feel entitled to be bullies. They see that they have some kind of political and legal prerogative to do so. This attitude to violence, which is particularly a trait of some men, not all men, but a lot of men, is also experienced at the grassroots level. I'm thinking now of family violence. Overwhelmingly, when we're talking about issues like gender-based violence, overwhelmingly, across the board, across the spectrum, men are the perpetrators of gender-based violence. Not all men. In fact, I'd argue the majority of men are not violent, but a significant majority of men are. And they've learnt to respond in a certain way. And the key to it is this nexus between fear and a sense of entitlement to respond with violence or control. Typically, a lot of the things that take place in family violence situations are about control. The man feels uncomfortable with what is going on, insecure, fearful, whole range of factors can be involved, not to mention socioeconomic circumstances, psychological factors. But the man feels a certain level of discomfort and tries to control the situation. The majority of family violence is about this exercise of control, controlling the phone, the schedule, the finances, all sorts of things in relationship to the female partner. And if the female's response doesn't fit what the male responds, the ante is upped. And often when violence eventually breaks out, if it does, language, just like the sort of language that Xi Jinping or Donald Trump might use, is also used. This is my house. You are my wife. You'll do what you're told, and I'm entitled to behave in a deplorable and even violent manner. It is scary stuff. Now, it bears repeating because I don't want to lose half my audience here today. This is not the annual sermon of let's get stuck into and blame all men. The majority of men are not violent. But sometimes that majority, and I'm including myself, we are complicit. We don't call out violence. We don't call out controlling behaviour. We don't call out violent language or violent speech. And on that note, in many ways, the church has failed miserably. Now, historically, we know that there have been churches and individuals who have played a very significant role in what we could talk about broadly as the movement against violence, or the movement for peace, the movement against war. But in recent decades, and perhaps it's because of our own self-preoccupation, there has been relative silence on the part of many of the mainstream churches on the question of violence. As people of faith, and in particular when I think of Christian leaders, it's very much part of our prophetic heritage to call out violence. As followers of the ministry of Jesus, who offered the promise of transformation, of deep and lasting transformation, then we call out violence with some sense of confidence that individuals and communities can be changed. So I'm not predicting or preempting any overnight solutions to this, but I am feeling that in the light of what is taking place in the world, we need a multitude of voices from different faiths, different perspectives, working with other groups, with groups like Black Lives Matter, with groups like LGBTIQ movements, of course many of whom are Christians as well. We need to develop an alliance of people who are not only committed to non-violence, but who are committed to working together collaboratively for the sake of others, who want to bring about transformation, not only personal transformation and social transformation. And so I just want to focus on just a couple of things. I think it's important that we identify and name violent thinking. Violent thinking is the sort of thinking where immediately people start to up the ante, that we start to speak aggressively, that we start to diminish the other person, that we start to treat the other person as enemy or as object under our control. So we need to name violent thinking and violent speech and violent behaviour. And it's important that we keep on naming these things, not only because we see them as morally wrong and unjust, but unless we do, there will not be any change. I am grateful that in recent decades I haven't bumped into Gary Hodges, although it would be funny if I did. You know, I think I'd be tempted now I'm older and hopefully a little wiser, to invite him to go for a cup of coffee and to see if he remembers that incident, and just reflect for a moment about the chemistry or what on earth happened there, because it's only now that I have an inkling about the kind of chemistry that took place. And I guess in a way that kind of conversation is the sort of thing that we need to encourage in our world today. Conversations about difference, about otherness, about how we live together, how we cooperate together, how we can even maybe love each other. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer. Amen.